It's fun to visualize what it might have looked like in the late 19th century.
You might have no idea that there used to be a huge set of railroad shops where dozens and dozens of locomotives were worked on.
Lots of buildings, lots of noise, lots of smoke.
Today we'd consider it pollution. In those days they considered it progress.
It's kind of fascinating history. It's kind of hidden history.
You would naturally be drawn to this location and the significance of it, but not really knowing what it was all about.
Well, the St. Paul and Duluth Railroad was started in the late 1860s and completed between St. Paul and Duluth in 1870. And that was a very rapid means. That was 14 hours to make a train trip. The maintenance yards were in downtown St. Paul, flooded quite often in springtime when the Mississippi River rose. Also, as the railroad grew in size, there was no room for the additional shops. So they chose Gladstone, which was for two reasons. First, it was the largest flat area of land outside of St. Paul. Secondly, as one of the board of directors, William Dawson, happened to own land, and he donated 30 acres of what was today the shops to the railroad in return for them building the maintenance shop.
Well, where we're standing right now is right in the middle of the roundhouse area of the Gladstone shops.
So 1886, the railroad decided they would build a maintenance shop. That would consist of a roundhouse capable of holding 25 locomotives, and also the shops capable of maintaining and repairing all of the freight cars, all of the passenger cars. By about 1889, 1890, they had over 2,500 pieces of rolling stock.
Any overhaul of the entire fleet, they'd all come in here. So it was a busy place. It was very active, trains backing up, trains coming in. Along basically Frost Avenue was a series of repair tracks, so all the trains would be sitting there waiting to be serviced.
When the shops opened in 1888, the newspapers talked about needing up to 500 workers.
From 1887 to 1900, he was probably one of the two major employers of the town here. You know, it was a good employer while it lasted.
Unfortunately, there were a lot of injuries. This is in the days when you did not have automatic couplers. You had to stand between two moving railroad cars and put a pin in, and if you didn't do your job right, you may have lost an arm, a leg, or been killed. But if you look at a map from that time period, there were not that number of houses to support several hundred people.
But a lot of people probably came from St. Paul walking on in. Of course, the roads were horrible. It was all dirt roads back then. Nothing was paved, so it would have been taking you a while to get here.
We know that there was a daily work train that carried supplies from the downtown area out to the shops. Maybe that was also a commuter train for workers. Gladstone really was a small rural area.
There's two main businesses here. There was the Plow Works and the Gladstone shops. The idea was to have this big manufacturing town spring up with those two as the anchors.
Because of the shops, we know that a hotel was built, that 30 people could live there. There were two boarding houses built.
Downtown Gladstone prospered back then. They had a number of saloons. So you can imagine it was a bustling place for a little while.
Entire communities in Minnesota were established only because they were in relationship to railroading and to railroads.
The fate of the St. Paul and Duluth was the fate of many railroads. It depended upon James J. Hill. St. Paul and Duluth was never financially very viable. They were always just kind of skating by. There was so much competition from all the other railroads.
It was very small potatoes in the grand scheme of railroads.
When James J. Hill started to build the Northern Pacific Railroad, he initially leased the St. Paul and Duluth to help make sure that the routes going up to the Northern Pacific were okay.
When St. Paul and Duluth was taken over by the Northern Pacific about the turn of the 20th century, they slowly phased out the shops over time.
And Gladstone, being out east, was just away from the main lines. It just didn't fit into their plans for long-term growth.
Without the shops to maintain those rails that went out across the state, we wouldn't have the system that we have today.
Fortunes were built and fortunes were lost, and that's kind of the story of the St. Paul and Duluth Railroad. Once they abandoned the site, they realized it would cost more to tear down the buildings. So they wound up renting it out first to Guthrie, a company called Guthrie, American Dump Car Company, Seeger, and then eventually Whirlpool in the end.
Well, my dad and mother bought a piece of land right over here on Chambers Street in 1934, built 35. And I was, at that time, about 6 years old.
So I looked over here at this the first time I looked at these large buildings and the fence around it, and I wanted to know whose castle it was.
You would naturally be drawn to this location and the significance of it, but not really knowing what it was all about.
You wondered what was in here as a kid, and well, it wouldn't be fun to go in there and look around, but
Most of these buildings stood until the late 1970s.
Anything above ground was demolished.
Pulled down the water tower, and I remember people all pulling up to pick through the bricks to salvage the bricks when I was a kid.
This is an image from the archaeophysics report. They looked at shading from that, and then they came out and they pulled over a radar, a ground penetrating radar, over big chunks of the site, moving around through the roundhouse area and back behind us where the shops are at. They were able to go through the layers below ground, a foot below ground, 2 feet below ground, 3 feet below ground, and they actually found places and locations where features were still in place.
You wouldn't have to dig far to find. The old Gladstone shops are still underneath the soil.
That was really exciting.
You can clearly see the rays of the roundhouse going out from where the cottonwood is at. They found large blocks of limestone from original foundation walls. They found poured concrete areas for making bays for repairs for locomotives, and all those were still intact.
You had the brick wall. It was on a limestone foundation, and at Gladstone, those limestone blocks were 3 feet wide.
Here's the cornerstone marking of the corner of the machine shop.
Even though these things are out of place now, they still tell us about the kinds of materials that were used in the construction of the shops.
The insides of the buildings were whitewashed. They had tall windows, so that really helped with lighting.
Absolutely. That reflects even more light and make it less of a dangerous, dark place to work.
We're in the Como shops, and I want to point out a couple structural features. Above is what was called the penthouse, which did two things. Number one is it allowed light to come into the middle of the building. The second thing is the windows could be opened to exhaust the fumes.
So right here is where the well used to be for the Gladstone shops. And you can imagine steam engines use a lot of water. Fire was always a constant danger at this place. When they cleared the site, they just kind of pushed everything into the well. They didn't really seal it. It took a number of years with the help of aerial photographs, GPS to locate the well. So picture it back in the day, there would have been this little shed, circular-like building right over where the well was, the well house. They properly sealed it, and this is where the well marks today. Nature's slowly reclaiming what was once here. It stayed vacant for a good 20 years.
They wanted to do some real development here, and we didn't go that direction.
Finally, in about 1999, the city of Maplewood had what they call open space program, where they would buy undeveloped land and keep it undeveloped, kind of as a parkland, partly as a nature preserve.
I think it's important that Maplewood recognize this property as significant in its history.
Quite a contrast from when you had the smoky, smelly sounds of locomotives shuttling cars around to now when it's just a quiet, natural preserve.
I was raised here for most of my life, and it's hard to let go, and this will always be Gladstone to me.